When I first met Luke, he was everything I thought I wanted. Tall, charming, and confident, he had a magnetic presence that made me feel seen, understood, and desired. Our courtship was a whirlwind, a series of candlelit dinners, stolen kisses, and promises whispered in the dark. Diana, had grown up in an orphanage, never knowing the comfort of a family, and Luke seemed like my chance at a real home. We met at a mutual friend's dinner party. I was hesitant to go, feeling out of place among the successful professionals, but my friend Jane insisted. "Diana, you need to get out more," Jane said, handing me a glass of wine as we walked into the elegantly decorated living room. "Besides, I have a feeling you'll enjoy tonight." I glanced around the room, taking in the clinking glasses and lively conversations. "I don't know, Jane. These people seem different." Jane rolled her eyes. "Nonsense. Just relax and have fun." That's when I saw Luke. He was across the room, laughing at something someone had said, his blue eyes sparkling with amusement. He caught my gaze and smiled, a slow, confident smile that sent a shiver down my spine. As the evening progressed, we found ourselves standing next to each other by the fireplace. "You look like you're not enjoying yourself," he said, his voice smooth and warm. I blushed. "I'm not really used to these kinds of gatherings." "Well, let me make it more enjoyable for you," he said, holding out his hand. "I'm Luke." "Diana," I replied, shaking his hand and feeling an electric jolt at his touch. The conversation flowed effortlessly. Luke was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in everything I had to say. He listened with an intensity that made me feel like I was the only person in the room. As the night wore on, he leaned in closer. "Would you like to get out of here? I know a little cafe down the street that's much quieter." I'd hesitated for a moment but then nodded. "I'd like that." We slipped out of the party and walked to the cafe, talking and laughing the entire way. It felt like something out of a fairy tale. Luke was perfect, too perfect perhaps, but I didn't let myself think about that. I was caught up in the magic of the moment. Over the next few months, Luke and I became inseparable. He showered me with attention, gifts, and grand gestures of affection. He introduced me to his friends, took me to fancy restaurants, and made me feel like a princess. I was in love, or at least I thought I was. One evening, as we sat on the balcony of his apartment, watching the sunset, he took my hand. "Diana, I can't imagine my life without you. Will you marry me?" he asked, his eyes filled with emotion. My heart leaped. "Yes, Luke, yes," I cried, throwing my arms around him. We were married in a lavish ceremony a few months later. I felt like the luckiest woman in the world. But as the weeks turned into months, the first cracks began to appear. It started with small things, a sarcastic comment here, a dismissive gesture there. I brushed them off, convinced they were just the growing pains of our new life together. One evening, as we were getting ready for bed, Luke snapped at me for forgetting to pick up his dry cleaning. "How hard is it to remember one thing, Diana?" he said, his voice sharp. "I'm sorry, Luke. I had a busy day and it slipped my mind," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. "Busy with what? Sitting around all day. You don't even have a real job," he sneered. I felt a pang of hurt but said nothing, hoping it was just a one-time outburst. But the incidents grew more frequent and more severe. Luke's temper flared over the smallest inconveniences, and his words cut deeper than any physical blow could. One night, after a particularly harsh argument, I tried to reach out to him. "Luke, can we please talk about this? What's happening to us?" He glared at me, his eyes cold and unyielding. "There's nothing to talk about. Just do as you're told and stop making everything so difficult." I retreated, feeling the walls closing in around me. I tried to make things right by being the perfect wife. I cooked his favorite meals, kept the house spotless, and attended to his every need, but nothing I did was ever enough. It was during one of those tense evenings that he brought up the subject of children. "I want a son, Diana. Someone to carry on my name," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. I want a baby too, Luke. I do, I said softly, hoping to bridge the growing chasm between us. Then make it happen, he replied curtly, turning his back on me. I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. I hoped that having a child would bring some light into our increasingly dark home. My pregnancy was difficult, fraught with complications that kept me in and out of the hospital. Luke's anger only grew during this time. He resented the attention I needed, the care and concern from others. His mother, a cold and bitter woman, echoed his sentiments, treating me with disdain and accusing me of being weak. I remember the first time the doctor sat us down to discuss the risks. Diana, your pregnancy is high risk, Dr. Williams said gently, looking at me with concern. Your blood pressure is elevated and we're seeing signs of preeclampsia. We need to monitor you closely. Luke sat beside me, his jaw clenched. What does that mean for the baby? He demanded, his voice hard. It means Diana needs to rest and reduce stress as much as possible. There's a chance we might need to deliver the baby early if her condition worsens, the doctor explained. That's unacceptable, Luke snapped. We need this baby to be strong and healthy. I understand, Mr. Harper, but our primary concern is the health and safety of both Diana and the baby, Dr. Williams replied, maintaining his calm demeanor. As we left the hospital, Luke's anger simmered beneath the surface. You're not trying hard enough, he muttered as we got into the car. I'm doing everything I can, Luke, I replied, tears welling up in my eyes. Clearly, it's not enough, he retorted, starting the car with a jerk. The months dragged on, each day a mix of hope and fear. I followed the doctor's orders meticulously, but the stress of living with Luke's unpredictable temper made it nearly impossible to relax. His mother Agnes often visited, her presence a cold shadow in our home. One afternoon, as I sat in the living room, trying to rest, she walked in unannounced. Her eyes scanned the room with disapproval before settling on me. You look terrible, Diana, she said, her tone devoid of any empathy. I told Luke you weren't strong enough to be a mother. I'm doing my best, Agnes, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Your best isn't good enough, she snapped. My son deserves a strong wife and a healthy child. Don't disappoint him. I bit back the tears, knowing that any sign of weakness would only give her more ammunition. I focused on my baby, feeling his movements inside me, and prayed for the strength to endure. The day Matthew was born was a stormy one, both outside and in our lives. I went into labor early, the complications finally catching up with me. As I was rushed to the hospital, I could see the worry etched on Dr. Williams' face. It's going to be okay, Diana, he said, squeezing my hand. We're going to take care of you. Labor was long and arduous, but when I heard Matthew's first cry, a wave of relief washed over me. He was here and he was healthy. I held him in my arms, tears streaming down my face as I looked at his tiny features. He's perfect, I whispered, kissing his forehead. Luke stood at the foot of the bed, his expression unreadable. At least you did one thing right, he said coldly before turning and leaving the room. My joy was overshadowed by his continued violence and his mother's contempt. The first few weeks at home were a blur of sleepless nights and constant tension. Luke's anger seemed to have no bounds, and every little thing set him off. One evening, as I rocked Matthew to sleep, Luke stormed into the nursery. Can't you keep him quiet? He snarled, glaring at me. He's just a baby, Luke. He's hungry, I replied, trying to stay calm. You're useless, he spat, turning on his heel and slamming the door behind him. I held Matthew closer, tears streaming down my face. It's okay, sweetie. Mommy's here, I whispered, rocking him gently. We'll get through this, I promise. My days revolved around Matthew, his innocent eyes giving me the strength to endure. I found solace in his smiles, his tiny hands grasping mine, and the way he looked at me with pure, unconditional love. But every moment of joy was tinged with fear, knowing that Luke's rage was never far away. Agnes continued her visits, her criticism relentless. She never missed an opportunity to remind me of my perceived failures. "You're not feeding him properly," she scolded one afternoon as I tried to nurse Matthew. "No wonder he's so fussy. He's gaining weight, Agnes." "The doctor said he's doing well," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Doctors don't know everything," she snapped, just like they didn't know how to prevent your complications. Her words cut deep, but I refused to let her see how much they hurt. I focused on Matthew, determined to be the best mother I could be, despite the constant barrage of negativity. It was a cold, rainy evening. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil in our home. Luke had come back from work, already in a foul mood. Nothing I did that evening was right. The dinner wasn't to his liking. The house wasn't clean enough, and Matthew's crying only aggravated him further. His anger escalated quickly, and before I knew it, his fists were flying. "Stop it, Luke, please," I cried, trying to shield myself with my arms. "Shut up, Diana. You're useless," he roared, striking me again and again. I collapsed to the floor, my vision blurred from the pain. Luke's rage seemed endless, his blows landing with terrifying precision. When he finally stopped, I could barely move. I heard him muttering curses as he grabbed his keys and slammed the door behind him, leaving me in a broken heap on the floor. Matthew's cries pierced through the haze of pain. I forced myself to my feet, every movement agony. I stumbled to his crib, my heart breaking at the sight of his tear-streaked face. "It's okay, baby. Mommy's here," I whispered, lifting him into my arms and holding him close. As I rocked him, my mind raced. I couldn't let this continue. I couldn't let Matthew grow up in this house of horrors. I had to leave, and I had to do it now. I moved as quickly and quietly as I could, wincing with every step. I grabbed a duffel bag from the closet and stuffed it with clothes for Matthew and me, along with some diapers, formula, and a few of his favorite toys. I didn't have much money, but I took what little cash I had managed to save. Every moment felt like an eternity, the fear of Luke returning hanging over me like a dark cloud. As I was packing, Agnes called, her voice dripping with disdain. "Diana, have you seen Luke? He's not answering his phone," she demanded. "He's out, Agnes." "I don't know where," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Well, when he gets back, tell him I need to speak with him. And make sure you don't mess things up any further. He's had enough to deal with because of you," she snapped before hanging up. Her words fueled my determination. I finished packing and wrapped Matthew in a blanket, kissing his forehead. "Hang in there, sweetie. We're getting out of here," I whispered. I slipped out the back door, the cold rain soaking us almost immediately. I walked quickly, glancing over my shoulder every few steps, half expecting to see Luke's car coming down the street. My heart pounded in my chest, but I kept going. I had to, for Matthew. When I reached the main road, I hailed a taxi. The driver, an older man with kind eyes, looked at me with concern as I got in, but he didn't ask any questions. "Where to?" he asked. "Just drive. I'll tell you when to stop," I replied, my voice shaking. We drove in silence, the rain pounding against the windows. I held Matthew close, his warmth a small comfort. After what felt like an eternity, we reached the suburbs. I spotted a rundown motel with flickering neon lights and told the driver to stop. "Are you sure, miss? This place doesn't look too safe," he said, glancing back at me. "It's fine. Thank you," I said, handing him the fare and a little extra for his trouble. I checked into the motel, paying for a week with the cash I had. The room was small and shabby, but it was a refuge. I locked the door behind us and sank onto the bed, cradling Matthew and letting the tears finally come. As the days passed, the money dwindled faster than I could have imagined. One cold evening, with nothing but the clothes on our backs and a few dollars in my pocket, I found myself walking down a desolate road, Matthew cradled in my arms. The cold air bit at my skin, and every step felt like a struggle against the overwhelming tide of despair that threatened to consume me. My thoughts were a whirlwind of fear and uncertainty when I saw an elderly woman ahead, walking slowly with a heavy basket in her hands. Suddenly, she stumbled and fell, the contents of her basket scattering across the ground. Without thinking, I rushed over to help her. "Are you all right?" I asked, bending down to assist her. She looked up at me, gratitude and pain etched in her lined face. "Thank you, dear. My old bones aren't what they used to be," she said with a weak smile. I helped her to her feet, picking up the scattered groceries and placing them back into her basket. As we worked together, she glanced at Matthew, who was staring at her with wide, curious eyes. "This is my son Matthew," I said, my voice tinged with a mix of pride and worry. The woman smiled warmly at him. "He's a beautiful boy. My name is Mrs. Harper. What brings you out here on such a cold evening?" I hesitated, then decided to be honest. "We have nowhere to go. I've been looking for work, but it's been difficult. We're out of money, and I'm not sure what to do next." Mrs. Harper's eyes softened with sympathy. "Well, you're in luck. I work as a cook at a large estate just down the road. The place could always use more help, especially someone willing to do cleaning. Come with me. I'll see if I can get you a job and a place to stay." Hope flickered in my chest. "Really? That would be a lifesaver. Thank you so much, Mrs. Harper." She waved off my thanks, leading me and Matthew down the road. The estate soon came into view, a grand mansion surrounded by well-kept gardens and high fences. Mrs. Harper guided us through a side entrance, avoiding the main gates. "Follow me," she whispered, leading us through the servants' quarters and into a small, cozy room. "You can rest here tonight. We'll sort everything out in the morning." I sank onto the bed, exhaustion washing over me. "Thank you, Mrs. Harper. I don't know how to repay you. Just get some rest, dear. We'll talk more in the morning," she said, patting my shoulder before leaving the room. I lay down with Matthew, my heart lighter than it had been in weeks. The warmth and safety of the room enveloped us, and I drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep. I woke to the soft sound of knocking. Mrs. Harper stood in the doorway, her expression a mix of urgency and reassurance. "Diana, wake up. The master of the house has returned from work and wants to meet the new cleaning staff," she whispered. "I told him you're my niece and have come from far away to find work. He trusts me, so he didn't ask for any documents. Just follow my lead." I nodded, my heart pounding with nerves. "Thank you, Mrs. Harper. I'll do my best." She smiled. "I know you will. Now, let's go." I picked up Matthew and followed her through the winding corridors of the mansion until we reached a large, elegantly furnished room. A man in his late 40s sat behind a mahogany desk, his sharp eyes assessing us as we entered. "Mr. Bennett, this is my niece, Diana," Mrs. Harper said smoothly. "She's traveled a long way and is in need of work. I thought she could help with the cleaning." Mr. Bennett looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. "If you vouch for her, Mrs. Harper, that's good enough for me. We've been short-staffed lately, and I could use the extra help. Diana, welcome to our home. I expect you to work hard and follow the house rules." "Thank you, Mr. Bennett. I promise I'll do my best," I said, relief flooding through me. "Very well," he said, turning back to his papers. "Mrs. Harper will show you your duties. You may go now." We left the room, and Mrs. Harper led me back to the small room where we had slept. "You did well, Diana. He's a fair man but has high expectations. Just work hard and keep your head down." "I will, Mrs. Harper. Thank you again for everything," I said, feeling a surge of gratitude. She smiled warmly. "We all need a little help sometimes. Now, let's get to work." With that, my new life began. Every day was filled with hard work, cleaning and maintaining the large estate, but I was grateful for the opportunity. Mrs. Harper was a constant source of support and guidance, and I quickly grew fond of her. Matthew thrived in the new environment, and his laughter became the bright spot in my days. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of stability and hope for the future. I was determined to make this opportunity count, not just for me, but for Matthew. We had found a safe haven, and I was ready to build a new life for us, one day at a time. Mr. Bennet had one rule that everyone in the mansion had to follow without exception. Never enter the room at the far end of the second floor. The door was always closed, and the only people allowed inside were doctors who came and went frequently. Mr. Bennet himself often emerged from the room looking somber and defeated. Curiosity gnawed at me, but I respected the rule and kept my distance. Yet the mystery of that room haunted me, especially on days when Mr. Bennet's grief seemed particularly raw. One evening, after an especially difficult day of cleaning, I found myself alone with Mrs. Harper in the kitchen. "Mrs. Harper, I've been meaning to ask you," I began hesitantly. "What's behind that door on the second floor? Why are there always doctors going in and out?" Mrs. Harper's face clouded with sadness. She put down the dish she was washing and sighed deeply. "It's Mr. Bennet's daughter, Lucy. She's 7 years old. 2 years ago, her mother passed away unexpectedly. Lucy was so traumatized by the loss that she became paralyzed. She can't move or speak, only blink her eyes." I felt a pang of sorrow in my chest. "That's heartbreaking. Is there nothing the doctors can do?" Mrs. Harper shook her head. "They've tried everything, but her condition hasn't improved. Mr. Bennet and the doctors feed her with a spoon. It's a terrible thing to witness, and it's broken his heart. That's why he doesn't want anyone else in there. He wants to protect her and maybe, in a way, protect himself from more pain." 3 months had passed since our arrival when an incident occurred that changed everything. It was a late night, and Mr. Bennet had just returned from a corporate party, visibly drunk. I was in the hallway, heading back to my room after finishing my chores, when I noticed that he had left the door to the forbidden room slightly ajar. My heart raced. I knew I shouldn't, but something compelled me to take a peek inside. Quietly, I pushed the door open a bit more and saw a small, pale figure lying in a bed surrounded by medical equipment. It was Lucy. She was gaunt and fragile, her eyes blinking slowly in the dim light. My heart ached for her, and I felt an overwhelming urge to do something to comfort her. I tiptoed into the room and gently sat beside her bed. "Hello, Lucy," I whispered, feeling a lump in my throat. "My name is Diana. I hope you don't mind if I keep you company for a little while." She blinked slowly, and I took that as a sign to continue. "Would you like to hear one?" I picked up a storybook from the nightstand and began to read softly. As I read, I noticed a flicker of something in Lucy's eyes. I couldn't tell if it was recognition or simply the comfort of another presence, but it gave me hope. Suddenly, the door burst open, and Mr. Bennet stormed in, his face twisted with anger. "What are you doing in here?" he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. Before I could respond, something incredible happened. Lucy, who hadn't moved a muscle in 2 years, slowly raised her hand and gestured towards her father, as if to say, "Stop." Mr. Bennet froze, his eyes wide with shock. "Lucy," he whispered, his voice trembling. He rushed to her side, tears streaming down his face. "Oh, my sweet girl," he sobbed, taking her hand and pressing it to his lips. "I've missed you so much." I stood there, stunned by what I had witnessed. Lucy's small gesture had broken through the barrier of her paralysis, if only for a moment. Mr. Bennet looked up at me, his eyes filled with gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you, Diana," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I don't know what you did, but thank you." I nodded, tears in my own eyes. "She just needed someone to read to her," I said softly. That night marked a turning point for all of us. Mr. Bennet's hope was reignited, and he became more involved in Lucy's care, often asking me to read to her. Lucy's small but significant progress brought a new sense of purpose to our lives in the mansion. The mansion was quiet that evening. Mr. Bennet was in his study, engrossed in his work. while I sat in Lucy's room with Matthew, now 4 months old, peacefully asleep in his stroller beside me. Lucy lay in her bed, her eyes following my movements as I picked up her favorite storybook. "Ready for another story, Lucy?" I asked softly, opening the book to where we had left off the previous night. She blinked once, her way of saying yes. I smiled and began to read, my voice filling the room with the gentle cadence of the tale. As I read, I glanced up to see Lucy's eyes shining with a light I hadn't seen before. Her lips moved slightly as if she were trying to form words. I paused, my heart pounding in my chest. Was she really trying to speak? Suddenly, in a voice barely above a whisper, Lucy said, "Mama." I froze, the book slipping from my fingers and landing on the floor with a soft thud. "What did you say, Lucy?" I whispered, hardly daring to believe what I had heard. "Mama," she repeated, a little louder this time. Her eyes were bright with emotion. "Mama, read me this book." Tears filled my eyes as I knelt beside her bed, taking her hand in mine. "Oh, Lucy, that's wonderful. You're remembering," I said, my voice trembling with awe and joy. From that moment on, Lucy's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. She began speaking more each day, her words and sentences slowly but surely returning. The doctors were astounded by her rapid improvement, unable to explain the sudden change. But I knew it was the power of love and the comfort of familiar stories that had reached her when nothing else could. 6 months later, Lucy was fully recovered. She was running through the mansion's gardens, her laughter echoing through the halls. Her transformation had brought new life to the household, and Mr. Bennett's gratitude towards me was boundless. He often joined us during story time, his eyes filled with wonder and pride as he watched his daughter flourish. One sunny afternoon, Mr. Bennett approached me with a smile. "Diana, how about we go on a little adventure today? I thought we could have a picnic by the lake. Lucy would love it. And it would be a nice break for all of us." I smiled, my heart warming at the idea. "That sounds wonderful, Mr. Bennett. I'll get everything ready." Mrs. Harper offered to take care of Matthew while we were away. "Don't worry, Diana. I'll look after the little one. You go and enjoy yourselves," she said, her eyes twinkling with kindness. We packed a basket with sandwiches, fruit, and lemonade, and soon we were on our way to the lake. The drive was filled with laughter and conversation, Lucy's excitement infectious. When we arrived, the serene beauty of the lake took my breath away. The water sparkled under the sunlight, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the surrounding trees. We spread out a blanket on the grass and settled down to enjoy our picnic. Lucy ran to the edge of the water, her face lit with pure joy. Mr. Bennett watched her with a smile, his eyes filled with pride and relief. "Thank you, Diana," he said softly, turning to me. "You've done more for my daughter than I ever could have imagined. You've brought her back to life." I shook my head, feeling tears well up. "It was Lucy's strength and your love that made it possible. I'm just grateful to have been a part of it." We spent the afternoon playing games, sharing stories, and basking in the warmth of the sun. Lucy's laughter was a constant melody, filling the air with happiness. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace and contentment wash over me. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the lake, Mr. Bennett turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Diana, you and Matthew are like family to us now. I want you to know that you always have a place here, with us." Tears of gratitude and joy streamed down my face as I nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Bennett. That means more to me than you can imagine." 3 days had passed since our idyllic picnic by the lake. Life at the mansion had resumed its usual rhythm, but there was an undeniable shift in the air. Mr. Bennett had been increasingly attentive to me, his gestures of kindness and moments of quiet conversation hinting at something deeper. One afternoon, as I was dusting the grand staircase, Mr. Bennett approached me with a soft smile. "Diana, can I interrupt your work for a moment?" I paused, looking at him with curiosity. "Of course, Mr. Bennett. What do you need?" He hesitated for a moment as if gathering his thoughts. I was wondering if you could join me for a drive. There's something I'd like to show you." Surprised but intrigued, I agreed. We left the mansion and walked to his car. As he drove, I couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and anxiety. The landscape blurred past us, and my curiosity grew with each passing mile. Eventually, we pulled up in front of an elegant boutique. To him, confusion written all over my face. "What are we doing here?" Mr. Bennett smiled warmly. "I want you to choose the most beautiful dress you can find, and shoes to match. Please indulge me." I blinked in astonishment. "Mr. Bennett, I can't accept this. It's too much." He shook his head gently. "Diana, please. Consider it a small token of my gratitude for everything you've done for Lucy and for this household. You deserve to be treated with kindness." Reluctantly, I agreed. We entered the boutique, and I was immediately surrounded by an array of stunning dresses. The staff, recognizing Mr. Bennett, treated me with the utmost care and attention. After trying on several gowns, I finally chose a midnight blue dress with delicate lace detailing and a pair of silver heels that complemented it perfectly. Mr. Bennett's eyes lit up when he saw me in the dress. "You look stunning, Diana. Absolutely stunning." Blushing, I thanked him. We left the boutique, and as he drove us to our next destination, my mind raced with questions. Where were we going now? We arrived at an upscale restaurant, its opulent exterior glowing softly in the evening light. Mr. Bennett helped me out of the car, his hand lingering a moment longer than necessary. Inside, we were shown to a private table with a breathtaking view of the city skyline. Throughout dinner, the conversation flowed easily. We talked about everything from literature to our childhood memories, and I found myself laughing more than I had in years. It felt natural, comfortable, and deeply personal. As dessert was being served, Mr. Bennett's expression grew serious. He reached across the table, taking my hand in his. "Diana, there's something I've been wanting to tell you." My heart pounded in my chest. "What is it, Mr. Bennett?" "Please call me James," he said softly. "Diana, these past few months, you've not only brought light back into Lucy's life, but into mine as well. You've shown me kindness, strength, and compassion. I have feelings for you, Diana. Deep feelings." His confession left me momentarily speechless. I'd sensed his growing affection, but hearing it spoken aloud was overwhelming. "James, I don't know what to say. You've been so kind to Matthew and me. You've given us a home and a new beginning. But," he squeezed my hand gently, "you don't have to say anything right now, Diana. I just wanted you to know how I feel. Take your time to think about it. Whatever you decide, you'll always have a place here with us." Tears welled up in my eyes as I nodded. "Thank you, James. I need some time to process this, but I appreciate your honesty more than I can express." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of emotions. As we drove back to the mansion, I couldn't help but wonder what the future held. James's confession had opened a door to possibilities I hadn't dared to dream of, but I needed time to sort through my feelings and the complexities of our situation. Back at the mansion, I changed out of the beautiful dress and into my comfortable clothes, my mind still swirling with thoughts. As I checked on Matthew, who was peacefully asleep in his crib, I realized that whatever happened next, I was no longer alone. I had found a new family here, and for the first time in a long while, I felt hopeful about the future. The following day, the mansion buzzed with activity as preparations for the banquet were in full swing. James's employees were coming to celebrate the corporation's recent success under his leadership. The house was filled with the sounds of clinking glasses, laughter, and the bustling of staff preparing for the evening. As the sun set and the guests began to arrive, I found myself assisting Mrs. Harper in the kitchen, ensuring everything was perfect. The dining hall was elegantly decorated, and the atmosphere was festive. James moved through the crowd, greeting his guests with a warm smile. But as I moved through the crowded room, my heart stopped when I saw a familiar face among the guests. Was Luke my estranged husband? Panic surged through me as our eyes locked. He looked shocked at first, then his expression darkened with anger. He pushed his way through the crowd towards me, his face contorted with rage. "There you are," he hissed, grabbing my arm with a painful grip. "I've finally caught up with you. Luke, please, let go." I pleaded, trying to pull away. "You think you can run away and hide from me?" he snarled, his grip tightening. "You're coming home with me now." Just as he raised his hand to strike me, a strong hand grabbed his arm from behind. James stood there, his face calm but his eyes blazing with anger. Luke's face twisted with fear as he recognized his boss. He knew James Bennett and the power he wielded. "That's enough, Luke," James commanded, his voice icy. "Let her go." Luke's face turned pale, and he released me immediately, taking a step back. "Mr. Bennett, I didn't realize she was here." James stepped between us, his presence dominating. "You will leave this house right now. You have no right to be here." Luke looked like he wanted to argue but thought better of it. He muttered curses under his breath and stormed out of the mansion, casting one last venomous look at me. Shaken, I turned to James, tears streaming down my face. "James, I need to tell you the truth. Luke is my husband. Mrs. Harper isn't my aunt. I lied to you because I was desperate and scared." James's expression softened. He reached out, gently wiping away my tears. He turned to the gathered guests and staff. "I'm sorry, everyone, but this banquet is over. Please, see yourselves out." The guests murmured in confusion but began to leave, sensing the gravity of the situation. Once the mansion was empty, James looked at me with a mix of concern and determination. He left the house, and for 2 days, there was no sign of him. The mansion felt empty without his presence, and I realized how much I missed him. The connection we had forged, his kindness, and the way he had stood up for me. Everything about him had become an integral part of my life. On the 3rd day, James returned. He walked into the mansion, looking weary but resolute. Lucy ran to him, and he scooped her up in a tight embrace. "I'm sorry I left you, sweetheart. I promise I won't ever leave you again," he whispered, kissing her forehead. Then he turned to me, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and resolve. "Diana, I've thought a lot about everything. I'm not angry about your deception. You did what you had to do to protect yourself and your son. And I've realized that I don't want to lose you." He took a deep breath, his eyes locking onto mine. "Diana, will you marry me?" He paused, then smiled wryly. "Well, after you divorce your current husband, of course." Tears of relief and joy filled my eyes. "Yes, James, I will. I want to be with you." His smile widened and he pulled me into a tight embrace. "We'll get through this together, Diana. You're not alone anymore." In the weeks that followed, with James's help, I initiated divorce proceedings against Luke. The process was difficult and stressful, but having James by my side made it bearable. Mrs. Harper and the rest of the staff supported us, their affection and loyalty unwavering. As the papers were finalized, James and I began planning our future together. The mansion, once a place of secrets and sorrow, was now filled with laughter and hope. Finally, the day came when my divorce was official. James and I stood in the garden, surrounded by friends and family, as we exchanged vows. It was a simple ceremony, but it was filled with love and promise. "I vow to always protect and cherish you," James said, slipping a ring onto my finger. "To be your partner and your friend, for better or worse." "I vow to love and support you," I replied, my voice steady despite the tears in my eyes. "To stand by your side, through every joy and every challenge." As we kissed, sealing our vows, I felt a sense of peace and happiness I had never known before. Together, we had overcome so much, and I knew that whatever the future held, we would face it together as a family.